Today, we're going to talk about death. Hey YouTube, Vertical Stacker here, and my caveat before we get going on this, though my profession is in the law, I am not giving legal advice. I'm going to give the same cheesy caveat that all the rest of you folks do when you're saying I'm not giving financial advice when I tell you to go buy gold and silver, or buy my gold and silver, or whatever. These are just opinions, right? These are opinions that we give on our channels as to things that we think you ought to do. So again, because I'm a lawyer by trade, I need to put that caveat out there. Everything I'm going to talk about today is valid in my jurisdiction, which is Idaho, but it may not be how things go in your jurisdiction in California or New Jersey or Texas or what have you. So if you are interested, after we have this brief discussion about the importance of having a will, if you're interested in learning more, then I would certainly encourage you to talk to an attorney in your state so that you can get the best legal advice on how to proceed. Because although a lot of rules of construction and many laws and statutes are fairly similar from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, they're also very different in many ways. And so I don't want to mislead anyone into thinking that what I tell you today would necessarily work in your jurisdiction. Consult an attorney where you live. Don't just take my word for it. But generally speaking, what I'm going to tell you today is pretty good stuff. So here we go. You know, as stackers, we all value the shiny stuff, don't we? And we all look at it for perhaps different purposes. For some, we look at gold and silver as a savings account. It's a lot harder to take this to a grocery store or to Cabela's or to a car dealership and say, I want to buy this, that, or the other, and hand them some gold or some silver coins. We generally have to exchange this, right, for our fiat currency, and then take that currency and either give it to the seller, or we have to deposit it and then write a check or whatever. But the important part is that it's harder to convert this quickly. We can do it, sometimes relatively quickly, depending on, you know, the buyers that we have in our area. But for the most part, it operates as a really nice savings account because we can't just go and grab a 20 out of the safe and run to the store and buy something, right? So I like that angle. Others look at this as an investment. Others still might look at this as a way to hedge inflation. Now, I'm not going to get into why we do each one of those. That's a video for a different day. But the end result, whether it's for a savings or a hedge or retirement, whatever, is that we value our stuff. We value our precious metals. They're not called unprecious metals. They're not called unflattering metals. They're not called dumb metals. They're precious. They're precious to us and to our utility. So because of that, it's really important, not only to Vertical Stacker, but to each one of you, that you have control of what happens to your stuff that you've amassed when you die. You don't want the state, whatever state you happen to live in, to tell you what to do with your stuff. Of course, you're dead. They'd be telling your personal representative, or some, whoever it is that's going to be taking care of your stuff. Now, I want to just go briefly over some Idaho stuff in intestate succession. What that means is if you die without a will. If you die without a will, what happens? Now, it can get really complicated because you have separate property, which is property that you owned outright before you were married. You have community property, and that's generally anything that you acquired after a marriage. So I don't want to get into the differences between the two, and because there are some things that differ when you look at intestate succession as to what type, how you characterize the property. But generally speaking, in Idaho and many jurisdictions, if you die and you're married, then your share of your stuff is going to go to your spouse if it's a community property state, right? So here's where it gets funky though. What happens if you die without a will and you're single? Or what happens if you and your spouse both die in a fiery car crash? Well, then they've got to look at the language of a will, if you have one, to find out what happens. And if you don't, guess what? Here's what's going to happen. The state's going to decide. Now, I'm just going to read real quickly. Some of the Uniform Probate Code in Idaho. It's ridiculous to understand. I'm a lawyer, and I would have to sit down and make a flow chart, draw some arrows, and try to figure this all out. But it says this, basically. If there is no surviving issue, parent, or issue of a parent, but the decedent is survived by one or more grandparents, or issue of grandparents, half of the estate passes to the paternal grandparents if both survive, or if the surviving paternal grandparent, or to the issue of the paternal grandparents if both are deceased, the issue taking equally if they are all the same degree of kinship to the decedent, but if an unequal degree, those of more remote degree take by representation. What? I know I read that fast, but I could read it slow 3 times forwards and backwards, and I wouldn't understand what the heck I just read. So there's a lot of legal mumbo-jumbo in there. There's a lot of terminology it's important to understand. I'm not going to go through that because I don't care. I know you don't probably either. But that's just one more reason when you see these words of kinship and degree and by representation and unequal shares and unequal degree, half this, half that, maternal, paternal. What? My goodness. Just have a will. And all that confusion should go away. Why? Because the will is your voice when you're dead. This is you coming out of your grave to dictate what happens with your stuff. Again, generally speaking. So it's a beautiful thing to be able to say, hey, I want my kids to take this. I want my sons to have this kangaroo. I want my daughters to have these Morgans. I want my parents to have these, I don't even know what these are, Silver Monarchs from 1974. Some of the first silver I ever had is silver that we actually got in 1974. Look at that. Nicely toned. So have a will, folks. If you're single or if you're married, and you don't have a will, but you have amassed a lot of stuff. You have a good stored value, whether it's equity in your home or precious metals. You need a will so that you can direct what happens to your stuff. Anecdotally, I received a phone call, I'd say about a month ago, from another attorney here in the Valley, and that attorney said, hey, Vertical, do you know this person? And I said, well, yes, I do. And I said, what is this about? He says, well, we found some paperwork from your office in his home. I says, well, what do you mean? What were you doing in his home? Well, he died. Oh, I'm so sorry to hear that. I love that guy. He was a nice guy, a really fun, good former client of mine, unrelated to, a will or anything like that. But here's the kicker, and this is really important. He actually came to my office probably a year ago, and he said, hey, Vertical, I need to update my will. And I said, okay, well, let's do it. He says, and he gets down, he starts writing stuff down on his existing will, right? He starts scratching stuff out and what he was scratching out was his old girlfriend's name, who he had left stuff to. By the way, I didn't draft his original will. This other attorney did. So he starts scratching stuff out and writes in some other stuff and scratches some other stuff. Well, one was his former girlfriend, his former church, his former friends. And so he had changed all of those things by scribbling on it. And he says, well, I need to make these changes. And I says, well, that's not the way you do it. The best way to do it is through this instrument and yada, yada, yada. He says, okay, well, when can we do that? I says, well, as soon as you want to, but, it's going to cost a little money and, we're going to have to do it this way. And so when you get your ducks in a row and you want to make these changes, let me know. He's like, okay, yeah, that sounds really good. And then he left. Well, I never heard from him again. And guess what? He died. He died. And so now his former girlfriend gets some of his loot. His former church gets some of his loot. and some of his former friends get some of his loot. So even though he had a valid instrument, he didn't do what was necessary to do an appropriate legal update to that, whether it was procrastination or lack of funds or whatever it was. And so he died. And unfortunately, even though he had an instrument, the instrument only does exactly what it tells the personal representative to do, and that is distribute my stuff to these people. So a will is not a fail-safe. A will is only as good as your intentions within it. So if you currently have a will, you might want to take a look at it, update it, make sure it's current, make sure your desires are consistent with what you would want to happen with your stack or your home or whatever. Likewise, if you don't have a will, then you better get familiar with who your grandparents, uncles, cousins, nephews, and degree of kinship are, because that's who's going to be getting your stuff. And that might not be what you want. So, much ado about nothing, or is death a big deal? It is a big deal. Next time maybe we'll talk about the other certainty in life, and that's taxes. Ugh, no thanks, I'll leave that to someone else. Death, folks, it comes to us all. Be prepared. Get your will in line. Vertical Stacker. Till next time.